Our next speaker is doctoral student Kirsten Tyler. She graduated with Bachelor of Science from University of Massachusetts, Boston. She loves snowboarding and beer. Kirsten does not have any children. Please welcome her in her presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. So the title of my talk is Investigating the Role of Phylogenetic Diversity in Facilitating Plant Invasions. So why do we care? The adverse consequences of plant invasions include consequences to ecosystem functioning, such as fire regimes, hydrology, and nutrient cycling, as well as threats to biodiversity. And in addition to these ecological threats, the economic threats are increasing. And for example, it costs us about $27 billion annually to deal with plant invasions due to damage. And so for these reasons, it's important that us as scientists and land managers understand the factors relating to plant invasions. Oh, sure, yeah. So what can we do? Traditionally, we have instilled management practices that control existing populations to keep the numbers down, but that's very costly. And we also monitor existing populations. We try to apply early detection and eradication, but this is usually unlikely. And so our best defense is prevention. And this is cost-effective, ecologically sound, and efficient. So now the question becomes, how do we prevent invasions? And really, the way we can prevent them is by understanding exactly how plants invade. So why do some plants become invasive while others do not? And this is like the holy grail question. Scientists have been developing hypotheses for years to understand this question, but it still eludes us. So this question is important to us because in order to prevent invasions, we need to understand why they occur in the first place. So I turn to Charles Darwin. And in his book, Origin of Species, in 1859, he wrote about plant invasions. And he observed that species living in stable, consistent conditions for extended periods of time with intense competition would be more suited to survive in a new habitat or a novel habitat. And really, how do we measure these observations? So Fridley and Sachs in 2014 developed this hypothesis, the evolutionary imbalance hypothesis. And what this suggests, based on Darwin's initial observations, is that species who come from or who are native to regions with deep and diverse evolutionary histories would be more likely to invade, and especially in regions with less diverse evolutionary histories. So this concept of evolutionary history is also something difficult to measure, but scientists have developed, Daniel Faith developed the Phylogenetic Diversity Proxy, which is the number of unique lineages and their divergence in a region. And that is to say, it accounts for not only the number of species in a region, but also how different they are from each other, or how related they are to each other. So then the evolutionary imbalance hypothesis states that species that come from regions of deep and diverse evolutionary histories where there are more species, where they are more diverse and less related to each other, should be more likely, invasive plants should be more likely to come from these regions. So to envision this phylogenetic diversity, this is a phylogenetic tree, and it represents the evolutionary relationships among a group of species. And we can see A through E is our group of species, and the horizontal lines in this diagram depict evolutionary time. They're called branches. And we can build one of these by collecting a series of traits or characteristics from a group of species, and those are usually found in gene sequences. So we'll take these gene sequences and using algorithms, we can find the most likely tree for this group of species, for this specific group of species. And then we can use this phylogenetic tree to calculate phylogenetic diversity by simply measuring the length of the branches in red and summing them. So for this region, the sum of the branch lengths for these species would be the PD, the phylogenetic diversity of this region. So we can say that phylogenetic diversity then infers the amount of evolutionary history in a region. And Fridley and Sachs in their study found this to be the case. So they found that species were more likely to become invasive if as the max PD, or as their PD increased. And the black lines represent species that were naturalized, and the gray line represents species that were introduced. So this is all well and good, but these results are difficult to extrapolate because they only focus on these three regions. And in order to extrapolate on a global scale or to make a difference, you need a larger study. More investigation, further investigation is needed. And so that's exactly what I'm doing. So these are my methods, and I'll just run through them quickly. So we've obtained a data set of 750 invasive plants, their native regions and where they're found to be invasive and where they're not. And then using the Q database, I am dividing the world into 52 regions based on a standardized method that Q uses. And so I can create floras or lists of species for each of these regions. And then using a very up-to-date mega phylogeny of about 33,000 plant species, vascular plant species, we can create a phylogeny for each region and then have these regional phylogenies. So with each of those, we can calculate the PD of all the global regions, and then we can compare those between native regions and non-native regions for these invasive plants. So just to illustrate this, we can take the PD of native region of invasive plant and compare that to the PD of each invaded region and non-invasive region. And so to really explain this, I'm just going to use an example, Japanese knotweed, Philippi japonica. It's a really pervasive plant, especially in Vermont. It was introduced in the late 1800s, and by 2000 it had spread across from the east to the west side of the country, originally from Japan. And we know that it's invasive in North America, in Europe, in New Zealand, and Australia, and the Middle East. And so those will be our invaded regions, and then the rest of the world would be the non-invaded regions. So we can compare the PD of native Japan to the invaded regions that we know, which are these that I just mentioned, and then we can also compare that to the non-invaded regions, which is the rest of the world. And we can calculate the difference between the native region of Japanese knotweed of Japan and each non-native region, and come up with this term PD diff, represented by PD diff. And we can plot this relationship. Now here I'm demonstrating what we might see with the Japanese knotweed. I do not actually have any data yet, so this is just an example of what we may see. But what we may see is that as the difference in PD between the native regions and the non-native regions increases, the probability of becoming invasive in that region also increases. So by calculating the difference in PD, this PD diff term, for all these 750 invasive plants and where they are non-native, and where they are invasive and where they are non-invasive, we may see a trend that can effectively model the probability of becoming invasive as a function of this PD diff term, or as of the evolutionary imbalance between these regions. So bringing it back, now what can we do about plant invasions? Well, managing is costly, eradication is unlikely, and to prevent is the is the most efficient and effective way. And to do this, we need to really understand why plant invasions occur. So this research does address some fundamental questions of why species invade, but there are also some broader impacts. We can inform the preventative management and allocate our resources to places where species will most likely become invasive, or allocate our resources to places where we might expect to be more vulnerable to invasions. And with that, I thank all of my people in UVM, my cooperators, and my funding sources, of course. Does anyone have any questions? Mm-hmm.
Is there a way for the regions that are not invaded to determine or control for if they're actually not invaded, or if they just haven't been invaded yet?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So that is something that I am dealing with right now, as to how to deal with potential invasions that have not occurred yet. But right now, the data set that I'm using is only includes species that have been invasive in these areas for more than 10 years. So I'm kind of controlling for that in that way, that this is definitely a success, and it's not like would be a failure, or potentially like the species have invaded and are successful there, and they're not found to be successful in other places. So in that way, I'm controlling for that, but I am also looking into other ways to control for that. Yeah, good question, Jen. Mm-hmm. Marina?
I have two quick questions about the floras that you were compiling.
About the what? The floras? Yeah.
My first question is, do you include all the species that from those regions in your flora, or only those that actually concur with the invasive species? Like from the, so are they at the regional level, at the regional level, or at the community level?
These are at the regional level. What I'm looking at right now is at the regional level, and I'm looking, and it's all angiosperms in that region, in the region. And actually, I just found a study yesterday, a 2017 study that came out with this. Have you heard of GLONAF? It's an invasive species database, and this study came out that has now been able to divide the globe up into like 750 regions or areas. And so I may use those types of methods instead, and actually focus in more deeply on smaller regions to, and using the floras, I can see if the plant is actually there, if the invasive plant is actually there or not, based on these regional lists. So yeah, I do have large regions right now, but I am looking to actually make them smaller, potentially.
And I was also wondering if you were planning to standardize the floras on the area of the region, because the larger the area of the region is, the more species you would expect to have.
That's a good question. I have not thought of that, but I will now. Yes, Bill.
Great talk. Really interesting projects. In our standard environmental science class here in invasion ecology, we always teach that there are these biological characteristics that predict invasive species. Predators, population growth rates, all those kinds of things. Do you think you could take this, like the PD, and you could put it in some of those other things, in some kind of like multivariate model?
Yeah,
That would give us like the ultimate predictive model.
Yeah.
of invasion?
Yeah, I am. I'm going to do that. I am.
The phylogeny is also be correlated with the traits. I mean, there's things to be coupled, so then how would you,
Right.
just thinking about that, which is interesting.
Yeah, I have plans to add things to this model, such as like time since introduction, and also look at some of those traits, seed size, and things like that, to add to see if there are multivariates, covariates. Yeah.
We have room for one more question.
Okay. One more question. Thank you.